Can find some as well to leave in the back.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Carrie. And thank you everyone for coming. So like Carrie said, my name is Anna and I'm a regional extension educator on the forestry team. I work down in Cloquet at the Cloquet Forestry Center, but I work across northern Minnesota. I work with woodland stewards, so people who own and care for woodlands in the northern part of the state. And a big focus for me in the educational programs that I deliver to these communities is thinking about resilience, especially to things like climate change. And so today I'm going to be talking about the Climate Ready Woodlands program, which is one of Extension Forestry's new programs that's all focused on providing recommendations for climate resilient tree species, as well as climate resilient native plants that we can foster in our woodlands. And thinking about those strategies that we can implement, whether we have 1 acre of woodland or 200+ acres of forest, these strategies that we can implement to improve the long-term resilience of our forests in this part of the state. So before I get started, who here would consider themselves a woodland steward? Again, doesn't matter if you have 1 acre or 200, or even if you don't own and you just care for woodlands. Awesome, so pretty much everyone here. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into it. I'm going to spend about 45 minutes to an hour on this presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I have a ton of handouts at the back covering a variety of topics, so I encourage you to grab those if you haven't already. Oops. One second. There we go. All right. So I want to quickly just recognize the rest of the team that works on the Climate Ready Woodlands program. So it's myself, as well as my colleague, Angie Gupta. She is the invasive species expert on the Extension Forestry team. She's based down in Rochester, but she covers statewide, and she is really focused in on invasive species. So if you have any questions related to invasive species, I might be able to answer some of them, but she is the expert. And then our colleague, Emily Dombeck, works her magic when it comes to communications for this program. So I want to just recognize them. So in terms of today's plan, I've broken it down into a few different sections. First, I'm going to talk about how the climate is changing and what that means for forests and woodland stewardship. Now I'm going to talk about the Climate Ready Woodlands program and talk specifically about what are these different lists that we've developed for all the different regions of the state. So talk about the specific species that are on those lists. And then I'll wrap it up in the third part of this presentation by talking about what are the specific strategies that you can use to apply these lists of species recommendations. What are some management strategies that you can use to improve the resilience of your woodlands, regardless of if you have backyard woods or you own a large wooded property. And so some of those strategies that we're going to be covering today includes enhancing diversity, opening up growing space, so trying to reduce competition between individual trees. Controlling invasive species is a big one. And then promoting forest health is another topic that we're going to be covering briefly. Before I keep going, you guys on this side, are you okay to see the screen okay if I stand here? Okay, well, if at any point if I'm blocking, just let me know. So first of all, what do I mean by resilience? And we're going to think about resilience in the context of forests. So a resilient forest is able to withstand a lot of changing conditions. So let's think maybe about a red pine stand. We can really picture this in our heads, probably a red pine plantation where they're all planted in rows, right? In a normal year, a historical year, let's say, if a bark beetle comes in, starts feeding on those pine trees are able to withstand those bark beetles, assuming that's a healthy, productive stand. And then maybe a drought comes in, that stand can withstand the impacts of the drought in a normal year. But then if we add in this additional layer of climate change, where climate change is a stressor on our forests, that reduces the ability of the forest to tolerate these changing conditions. So it pretty much, well, all right, I'm not gonna be able to do it quicker. But pretty much climate change, again, reduces the ability of the forest to tolerate all these changing conditions. So maybe with climate change, we're getting warmer annual temperatures, we're getting more drought, we're getting warmer winters. So we add in that stress on top of the bark beetles, on top of the drought that already occurs, and suddenly that red pine stand is too stressed and that red pine dies off, and maybe it turns into an oak and maple stand, for example. So it changes into something different. A resilient forest is able to withstand those stressors while still maintaining its own characteristics, maintaining itself as a forest. So we want resilient forests in the long term, and I'm going to be talking about those strategies to do so for the rest of this presentation. So now I'm going to start off by ripping off the Band-Aid of talking about the climate data, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and we've all experienced these changing climate trends, but I'm just going to talk about this first and then talk about those strategies. So first of all, as we've been experiencing over the last several years especially, we recognize that our climate is warming up on average, and we can see this average warming trend since the early 1900s. And of course, we're going to have really cold, frigid winters. We're going to have mild summers. We're going to get that fluctuation from season to season. But what's important is when we're looking at this trend across time, we can see that annually our average temperatures are increasing. We are getting warmer here in Minnesota. And we can see these warming temperatures manifested in the change in the plant hardiness zones, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you like to garden or if you're choosing trees for your yard, etc. So last year in 2023, late in 2023, the USDA released new plant hardiness zones. The last time those new zone maps came out was 2006. And if we look at the differences, we can see that zone 3A, that lightest purple, which is the coldest zone in Minnesota, which before was covering a good portion of northern Minnesota and northeast part of the state. That zone 3A in 2023 has shifted significantly northwards. And at this point, unfortunately, it's almost entirely out of Minnesota. We can also see zone 4A, which previously in 2006 covered central Minnesota, thinking about Pine County over to the western part of the state. That zone 4A has also shifted northwards. But what's good is when we look at the North Shore, we can see we're staying pretty stable along the North Shore. And that just shows that Lake Superior is really good at buffering the climate, which I'll talk more about later on. So in addition to these warming temperatures, we're also getting more precipitation on average. So again, looking at this trend across time, we can see precipitation increasing annually. And we still have a lot of really, really dry years scattered in there, as well as some really wet years with a lot of rain. But that trend line is increasing on average since 1900. But the dynamics of how that precipitation is actually occurring isn't as simple as we're just consistently getting more rain across the year. Instead, we're getting more frequent large precipitation events, which we've also experienced definitely these last few years, where instead of just getting steady increased rainfall across the year, we're getting really large rainfall events. And this is concerning because when we get a high amount of rainfall in a short period of time, this causes erosion in our forests. And so that decreases soil and health, or soil health and forest health, but it also stresses our infrastructure. So thinking about our roads, culverts, etc. I'm going to go back over here because I think the clicker works better when I'm on this side. But between these large rainfall events, we're also getting longer periods of drought. So up until this past growing season in 2024, we had been in a drought for the last 3 years, or last 4 years consistently. And so this is just becoming more and more common, where we're getting these longer, more frequent periods of drought, which are separated by these large precipitation events. So instead of being pretty consistent with our precipitation patterns, where we're getting a consistent amount of rain just throughout the year, instead we're jumping back and forth between these two extremes of drought and large precipitation events. And it's important to think about these extremes because these extreme climate patterns are what define the tolerance levels of our trees. So trees are adapted to these extremes. So if we're constantly jumping back and forth between these two extremes, that's putting additional stress on our trees and forests. And then again, as we've all experienced, our winters are getting warmer. We are seeing increasing minimum temperatures. And with looking back at the last 30 years, we can see the 10 warmest days have occurred in these last 10 years. So overall, our winters are getting warmer, and then that impacts our snowfall and frost dynamics in our forests. Okay, so like I said, I just rip off the Band-Aid of talking about the climate data early on in this presentation because my goal for this talk is I want to empower hope and agency in all of you, because as woodland stewards, forests are actually one of the best tools in our toolbox that we have for fighting climate change. We have a lot of agency that we can use to promote the health and resilience of our forests, and that has a big positive impact on climate. But when we talk about all this climate data, it is totally understandable and normal to feel eco-anxiety. And eco-anxiety is just that feeling of anxiety, grief, loss, etc., when it comes to the changing environment and the changing climate. My colleague Angie Gupta, who I mentioned earlier, she's been doing more and more work related to eco-anxiety because she keeps hearing that this is something that people feel. And I feel it myself, definitely working in this field. And so an important part of this is to recognize that this is a valid feeling and to give yourself space to process that. And again, knowing that as woodland stewards, we have a lot of power by caring for our woodlands and being active caretakers, regardless of if we have an acre or a larger property. We have a lot of power to care for our woodlands, which have such a big positive impact on the climate. And I won't do this now just for the sake of time, but something that my colleague Angie implements into her presentations is taking a resiliency break and using box breathing. And this is a strategy that you can use anytime that you'd like, anytime that you're feeling some of these emotions, and no one has to know that you're doing it. I think it's a great strategy. And so all it is you're just breathing in for 4 counts, holding for 4 counts, breathing out for 4 counts, and then just breathing slowly for another 4. And then you just repeat that process and it'll bring some calm to you in that moment. So I think this is really useful for these feelings of eco-anxiety, especially in the last few years where it seems like we can really see the climate starting to change, and especially seeing those impacts on our ecosystems around us. So now I'm going to talk about, well, what can we do? What are these strategies that we can implement to improve the resilience of our woodlands in the face of a changing climate? So first, I want to just define a couple of terms that they're 2 very broad categories when we're talking about the different actions that we can take when it comes to climate change. So first is mitigation. Mitigation is the idea of trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, that we're putting out into the atmosphere right now. In the forestry world, this could look like trying to increase the amount of carbon that our forests store and the amount of carbon that we have in forest products. So this is an example of mitigation specifically. Adaptation is the other side of that same coin. Adaptation is just trying to adapt to the climate change that we've already committed to, and that's already in the pipeline. And so what this could look like is planting a variety of tree species that are well suited to the future climate. So adapting for the future with climate change. So like I said, these are 2 sides of the same coin and they need to be implemented in tandem. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to just be talking about adaptation. That's the focus of the Climate Ready Woodlands program. And it's important to be thinking about adaptation specifically here in Minnesota, because we are really lucky in Minnesota to have 4 unique biomes coming together in our state. And that includes the southern border of the boreal forest, where many of these tree species are at the southern border of their range. And so that means with climate change, as our temperatures warm, as our precipitation patterns change, that deciduous forest, which covers the southeast and central part of the state, has the possibility of shifting northwards as that boreal forest begins to shift northwards. So adaptation is really important so that we can think about how do we maintain and improve the resilience and health of the boreal forest so that we can keep these forests on the landscape that we all know and love so well. And there's a lot of great work going on in Minnesota related to climate adaptation. There are a lot of experiments going on looking at how climate change impacts our forest ecosystems, especially here in the northern part of the state. The Superior National Forest just released an assisted migration plan, and Native nations that share geography with Minnesota are also implementing adaptation in their own lands. And so one of these tools that Extension developed is the Climate Ready Woodlands program. And this is a tool for you all as woodland stewards, people who own and care for woodlands. This is a tool that you can use to improve the resilience of your woodlands, regardless of what your goals are for your woods. Maybe you have 1 acre of backyard woods and you want to diversify it and promote some climate adapted species. Maybe you have 300 acres and you want to be looking at a larger scale stewardship plan that incorporates these climate adaptation elements. Climate Ready Woodlands program is a toolbox that you can select from based off of your goals. And so as I mentioned at the very start of this program, the Climate Ready Woodlands program consists of lists of climate resilient tree species, climate resilient understory plants that also provide benefits to critters, and that includes pollinators, birds, small mammals, etc., all those critters that we love. And then we also have tree species that may be more vulnerable to the changing climate, or they're impacted by a critical forest health concern. We're putting those in what we're calling a refugia category. So these are trees that still have tremendous ecological and cultural value, But because they're vulnerable to climate change or a forest health threat, they might need some different management strategies to help foster their long-term resilience. So we have these 3 different lists for all 11 ecoregions of the state. So that's 33 unique lists. And today I'm going to be talking about Region 2, which is where we're located today in the northeastern part of the state. And I'm going to be walking you through how you can access these lists and what the actual content of the lists are. But for easy access, if you would like, you can scan a QR code or write down this link here, and that'll bring you directly to our website. And I'll have this QR code up over the next several slides so you can scan it if you would like. But before I dive into the list, I just want to quickly cover how we developed these lists because we use a research-based methodology. These lists are derived from climate models from the DNR as well as the USDA Forest Service. And so like I mentioned already, we divided these lists for tree species specifically. I'll talk about plants in a second. But for tree species, we have the refugia lists and climate-ready trees. So what we did is we looked at all of the species in all of the forest and native plant communities in the state. And then we categorized all their different climate ratings and put them into either the refugia list or the climate-ready list. And some species, even if they performed really well in terms of their climate projections, we still had to put them in refugia because they were threatened by a critical forest health concern. And this includes the ash species because of their vulnerability to emerald ash borer, as well as butternut, which is impacted by butternut canker. So these are population level threatening forest health concerns because we couldn't consider every single forest health threat. For example, spruce budworm is a native insect that feeds on many of the spruce and balsam fir in this region. But balsam fir and spruce didn't perform well in terms of climate, but I'll talk about that in a second. But there are insects and diseases that feed on every single tree, which is why we only consider these population level threatening, mainly invasive diseases and insects. And then for plants, we had to do something different to develop these lists because unfortunately there's not climate projections for all these little understory plants. And so we had to figure out how to assess climate resilience for these understory plants. And so what we did is we looked at the current range of those little native plants. If an understory plant, such as large-leaved aster, which is very common all throughout northern Minnesota, if we looked at large-leaf aster, we could see that its range extends far to the east and far to the south of Minnesota. And so therefore, we considered it climate resilient because its native range already covers a wide range of climatic conditions. And that's how we considered it climate resilient. And we also documented all those benefits for microfauna. So pollinators, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, etc. We also looked at other ecosystem services as well. We documented all of this for all of the native understory plants in the state. And hopefully, eventually soon, all this plant data is going to be uploaded into an extension database that you can easily search and access all of this detailed information. Because as you'll see when you go to the website, we have spreadsheets or tables on the website, and we can't fit all of that great information about all the wildlife benefits into a table. So all that's going to be put in a database that'll be easy to access, hopefully sometime soon. So now I'm going to talk about what's actually in these lists and how you access them on the website. So if you go to this QR code, which is the same one I had up earlier, it'll bring you to this main landing page for the Climate Ready Woodlands program. And we're going to have a few different pages. The one that I'll be going into is the recommended trees for climate ready woodlands. We also have information on just general management strategies for creating those climate refugia. So how do we protect those vulnerable species that may be impacted more negatively by climate change? We also have information about assisted migration, also talking about invasive and non-native species, as well as general woodland management recommendations, such as thinning down at the bottom. But I'm going to zoom in here to talk about the recommended trees. And like I said earlier, we're up here in Region 2, the Northern Superior Uplands. But if you're interested in any other part of the state, we have that covered as well, and you can click into those as well. And so for each region, we're going to have a background on what's the geology of this region, what are the general forest types, etc. And when we scroll down, we're first going to see the list of climate-ready trees. So again, these are these climate-resilient tree species that, based off of the models, look like they're going to perform pretty well in terms of climate change going forward into the future. And when we look at this list, we see a very familiar cast of characters. We see our native pines, jack pine, red pine, white pine. We also see some oaks, such as white oak, northern red oak, pin oak, and bur oak. also our maples, and yellow birch, which I love. So a very familiar cast of characters, and many of these are probably already in your backyard woods, in your forested property, etc. Something important to note is that red oaks, so that's northern pin oak and northern red oak, are both susceptible to oak wilt. Luckily, oak wilt is not up in this region yet. Something to be on the lookout for. The furthest north it is in Pine County. It's a very slow moving disease. It's a non-native disease that impacts red oaks most negatively. So it's just something to be aware of, but it's not here yet. So don't need to put up the red flags yet. And then also American elm looks like it's going to be really climate resilient in a lot of parts of the state, which is really exciting. But if you're looking to plant American elm, you just want to make sure to get disease resistant elm. And so with any of these species, as you're looking at this and thinking about, well, what should I plant in my woodland, or what do I want to promote? You want to be promoting a mix of species. Don't just plant any one of these species. Go for that biodiversity. Go for a mix of species, because we don't want to be putting all of our eggs in one basket. All right. And then, of course, you want to be matching the species to the site, because even if a species is predicted to be really climate resilient, if we're planting it in the wrong site, of course, it's not going to do well, even though it was modeled to do well with climate change. So for example, we don't want to be planting northern pin oak in a swamp. Just because it's climate resilient doesn't mean it's going to do well in a swamp. So trying to make those decisions to match the species to the site. And when you go to the Climate Ready Woodlands site, we have information on soil preferences as well as light preferences. So you can help make those more site-specific decisions. And then also note that some of these species are going to be easier to purchase than others. So for example, the pines are going to be a lot easier to purchase than basswood, for example, which is harder to cultivate. So the nursery availability is really going to also be a factor in your decision making when it comes to what species to purchase. But a lot of these species might already be present in your woodland, and so you can just foster them through some of the management strategies that I'll be talking about in the last third of this presentation. And then if you keep scrolling down on that website, you'll see those refugia lists. So again, these are those vulnerable species that may perform less well with climate change, or they're going to be impacted by that critical forest health concern. And so I want to call out black ash and green ash. Both of those native ash species actually performed pretty well in terms of climate resilience. But because of emerald ash borer, we had to move them here into this refugia category. Yes.
How do you recommend protecting ash? I have a lot of black ash in my property. I've been debating doing injections, and it's really expensive, and
Yes.
you have to do it every year, I guess.
Yeah, so it's kind of, you have to weigh those pros and cons in terms of like how many trees you have and how much would it cost to inject them. Because that's definitely probably the best option if we're talking about a small scale, is to do those injections. Just because unfortunately our native ash species don't have any really immunity to emerald ash borer. So those injections are going to be the best bet on a small scale.
So how do you choose? I mean, say you have 20 black ash trees, I'm only part of tree 5 or 6. Do you do them in a cluster, or do you try to get the biggest trees scattered through your property, or is there a strategy that makes more sense for treatment?
That's a really good question in terms of scattered versus clumped, and unfortunately I don't have the answer right off the top of my head.
Question for Angie?
Yes, Angie, she wrote the ash management guidelines for emerald ash borer, and that has information like that. And I'd be happy to provide that information in like a follow-up email afterwards. She does most of the work with the EAB. I have a flyer in the back, which is about adapting ash forests, but that's thinking more about replacement species and not so much about mitigation for EAB. But I think that there is an answer for clumped versus scattered. I just don't want to give the wrong answer. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yep. All right. Yeah. So those ash species are susceptible to EAB, but they still, yes, go for it.
So on the emerald ash borer,
Yeah.
you need to hope for the really cold winters, because they won't survive anything colder than -29 Fahrenheit. And at my house, we didn't get that cold last winter, but the previous winters we've hit that, and there's a lot of black ash, so we're hoping for a really cold January nights.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. Yeah, that deep freeze will kill off a large portion of their population. So I'm really also hoping that we get a cold winter, because it was a little bit anxiety inducing last year with how warm it was, especially after EAB was found in Cass County end of last year. So Thank you for that. That's really important. And I will be talking on another slide a little bit more about adapting black ash wetlands and thinking about replacement species. But I'm not going to go super in depth on EAB, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those at the end. And if there's any I can't answer, I'll direct you to Angie. Okay, so for these refugia species, so again, those that are impacted by forest health threats, like our ash species, those still have tremendous ecological and cultural value. So we want to think about how we can protect and adapt those forests. There are also species such as balsam fir and white spruce, which didn't perform as well in terms of climate change. And they're also the preferred host for spruce bloodworm. And so that those are management strategies that we can implement, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to help promote the resilience of balsam fir and white spruce, especially when we're thinking about spruce bloodworm and climate change. But when we talk about refugia management, this consists of not only species, but also thinking geographically, thinking about areas on our landscape that will be buffered from climate change. And as I mentioned in the beginning, when I showed that graph of the hardiness zones, the North Shore was pretty buffered from those changes in the hardiness zones. And so Lake Superior does a great job of keeping the climate cooler and more moist along the shore. And so this is a great place for promoting these climate refugia, protecting these vulnerable species, because Lake Superior helps to buffer the impacts of climate. North-facing slopes has a similar effect. North-facing slopes are naturally cooler and a little bit more moist than our south-facing slopes. This is a good place to promote some more of these vulnerable species, as well as wetter sites. So thinking bogs, swamps, and even areas that have been impacted by beavers. These wetter sites are going to, of course, be just less prone to drought impacts just because they're already wet. And so these are good spots to consider promoting refugia. But just in general, when we're thinking about species that are more vulnerable to climate change or forest health threats, again, we want to be focusing in on species diversity, not just putting all of our eggs in one basket for any one of these species, but leaning into our species diversity. And then also trying to reduce competition between our individual trees, which I'll talk more about in a upcoming slide. But trees, they need sufficient growing space in order to be healthy and resilient. And growing space are just the resources, so think light, water, and nutrients, as well as physical space that trees need to grow. When trees are really crowded and competing with each other, they're not getting the resources that they need, and so they're not going to be as healthy as they could be. So trying to go in and reduce competition will help those trees be more resilient and healthy in the long term. And again, just being aware of our local forest health issues, whether that's spruce budworm or emerald ash borer, keeping those things on your radar so that we can be proactive when it comes to managing our woodlands and just being aware of when a threat could be impacting our forests. And things like spruce budworm, that's a native insect. And like I mentioned earlier, there are native insects and native diseases that impact every single tree species in the woods. But the main concern is thinking about those invasive forest health threats, such as emerald ash borer. Those have the biggest negative impacts on our forests. So those we really want to be thinking about. Emerald ash borer and oak wilt are two that always come to my mind. So now thinking about those climate ready native plants. So again, these are looking to be climate resilient and also provide all those wildlife benefits and other ecosystem services. And this is another familiar cast of characters. And this includes some shrubs as well as our herbaceous plants. So thinking about shrubs such as serviceberry or chokeberry, and some understory plants such as large flowered bellwort, which many of these species are what we would see if we were to walk out into the woods now. So a familiar cast of characters that if you already have these on site, you can work to promote those, especially by removing invasive species. Invasive species are great at out-competing our native plants. And so by doing the very hard work of removing invasive species, that will help to promote our native understory plants and promote a diversity of those understory plants. And then also some soil and water conservation districts have native plant cells if you're looking to plant native plants in your woods or in your backyards woods. So that's an option as well if you want to put in a little bit more diversity in addition to what's already there. Okay, so those are the contents of the list. And the handout in the back that says Northern Superior Uplands at the top, that includes these lists in writing. So you'll have that in that packet as well, and it's available on the website. But now I want to move into the last third of this presentation and think about how do we actually apply some of these adaptation concepts in our woods to improve the resilience of our forests. And so first of all, you might be thinking, well, what's the best option? What is the best way for me to improve the resilience of my woods? And at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet answer. The best thing is there's a spectrum of options that you can implement, and it all depends on your own goals and ways that you connect with your woodland. What do you most value, and what do you want your woodland to look like in the future? So there's no one single best option. There's a variety of options. So think about, what are your goals for your woodland? What do you most value? Maybe you really like going out and cross-country skiing in the winter. Maybe you really enjoy foraging and collecting those non-timber forest products from your woods. Maybe you really enjoy bird watching. What do you most value and resonate with in your woods? What do you want your woodland to look like in the future? Maybe you have one of those red pine plantations right now, and maybe you think it's not as healthy as it could be, and you want to try to promote some more diversity of hardwoods, for example, in your red pine plantation. Or maybe you have a maple oak forest right now, and you want to keep it the same as now in the future with climate change. Thinking about what you envision your forest looking like in the future, or maybe you're flexible and you're open to whatever comes down the pike, and you just want to support the forest in doing what it needs to do. And the approaches that I'm going to be talking about on the next slide, which are going to be some broad categories, and then I'll narrow it down. These approaches are not mutually exclusive. As I've said multiple times, we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. We want to be experimenting, tinkering in our woods and seeing what works best, and implementing multiple approaches across the spectrum that I'll talk about next. So in terms of this spectrum, we can categorize adaptation strategies into resistance, resilience, and transition. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. The management recommendations I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation span across this spectrum. But this just helps us categorize these different approaches and help us think through what we want to do in our woods. What's our plan? What do we want our woods to look like in the future? So resistance strategies try to maintain what we have now for as long as possible. So this is trying to put up a wall and buffer the impacts of climate change for as long as we can. So this is especially relevant when we're thinking about protecting these vulnerable species in the long term with climate change. Resilient strategies is somewhere in the middle of where we're okay with some degree of change in our woods, but essentially we just want to help the forest tolerate this wide range of changing conditions while still maintaining its own current conditions with a little bit of change, which is okay. Just allowing it to bounce back after disturbances, whether that's drought, insect infestation, warming winters, etc. Just helping it bounce back easier from those disturbances. And then transition is where we are looking forward into the future and intentionally facilitating change to something different. So again, this would look like changing our red pine plantation to more of a hardwood dominated stand. This is an example of a transition strategy. And I'll be talking about in a future slide with adapting black ash wetlands, where we are planting some replacement species in preparation for EAB. This is also an example of a transition strategy. Assisted migration is also a term that we hear more and more frequently, I think, as of late, when it comes to forest adaptation. And so I'll just quickly define what this is here. So assisted migration on the climate adaptation spectrum has a higher level of risk because it is so forward-looking typically. But there are 3 different levels of assisted migration. But assisted migration itself is just the human-assisted movement of seed sources or species specifically in response to climate change. Starting off with assisted population migration, this is where we are moving a species within its current range, but just moving between seed zones. So think about moving white pine that was planted and grew in southern Minnesota and planting that maybe here in northern Minnesota. That would be an example of assisted population migration. We are moving within that species native range, but we're just taking from a seed zone further south and moving it up north. That's an example of assisted population migration. Assisted range expansion is where we're moving a species just beyond its current range. So think about a species could naturally be moved just beyond its current range in the long term, perhaps. It hasn't crossed what we're calling a dispersal boundary. So that could look like planting swamp white oak, which is native, the northern part of its range is central Minnesota, planting swamp white oak in northern Minnesota. So just moving beyond that dispersal boundary. Assisted species migration is way jumping over that dispersal or migration boundary. So this could look like planting American holly from Kentucky and planting that somewhere in Minnesota. That's assisted species migration. So that's way beyond what would be possible by natural dispersal. And just as with any of these adaptation strategies, there's risk associated with each of these. Risk is going to be lowest when we're using assisted population migration, because, for example, we're just pulling from a seed zone south of us. And risk is going to be highest with assisted species migration because we're planting a species from very far away. So assisted migration as a concept in the research is still a relatively new thing. Humans have been moving species around for millennia. But in terms of forestry and management, this is still relatively new. And so guidance is still in the process of coming out about assisted migration for landowners specifically. So before I get into the management recommendations, I have one more like context slide and thinking about risk. What do I mean by risk? It's important to define that because there's always this level of uncertainty and risk when we're talking about climate adaptation. So risk could be the risk of our management practices not working as expected. Maybe we went in and did a thinning and the trees didn't respond to that thinning as we expected them to. That's an example of risk. There's the risk of financial losses. Maybe I go in and plant all white pine and northern white cedar, and then the deer come in and eat all those seedlings. Well, I just lost out on a lot of money. That's an example of risk. There we go. There's also the risk of unexpected disturbances happening. So maybe we get a flood or a really bad drought year and that impacts our management. That's another example of risk. As well as there's always the risk of unintended impacts to other parts of the ecosystem with any decision that we make when it comes to stewarding our land. There are so many feedback loops and webs within forests that we don't fully understand. And so at a certain level, we just have to embrace that uncertainty and make the decisions with the best information we have, just being active caretakers of the land, because we can't understand every single feedback loop in these systems because they are so complex. But that risk is always going to be there. And so one question we might be asking is, how do I know that the trees that I plant are actually going to survive with climate change? And again, we can make the best decisions, we can make the best decisions we can with the most information we have to make these decisions when it comes to planting trees. There's always going to be that risk of something happening, but we just have to do our best to mitigate that risk. And so like I keep saying, just don't put all your eggs in one basket. Try to diversify these adaptation options. And so now thinking about management strategies, I'm going to be talking about best practices for resilience. And these are just great rules of thumb, really for any context when it comes to forestry. It doesn't just have to be about climate change resilience. These are just good best practices for forestry in general. But thinking especially about resilience, diversity is key. Diversity is one of the best tools that we have to improve the resilience of our woods. And so diversity can look like a few different things. It could be species diversity. So promoting a diversity of tree and plant species in our woods, which I've already talked about a bit. So choosing multiple species from those lists that I showed earlier and trying those out, promoting a variety of tree species in your woods. And so maybe you're not planting all these tree species, you can also promote them through management. So if we have a larger acreage, this could look like harvesting in gaps. So removing these gaps of trees in our woods. And what this does is by removing gaps or bringing in more sunlight into these gaps, that's going to promote species that love high levels of light. And then when we harvest in gaps like that, what that causes is a matrix of different tree species across the landscape that like those different levels of light. They have different shade tolerances. So we have a variety of species across the landscape when we go in and manage. And what that also does is it simulates natural disturbance. So maybe a windstorm comes in and blows down a lot of trees in a little gap or a part of the stand. By harvesting in ways like this, it helps to emulate that natural disturbance. Oops. And then we also have age class diversity. We want to promote a variety of ages of trees because trees provide benefits in all parts of their life cycle. So young trees, old trees, these are all critically important for different parts of the forest. So it's really crucial to promote this variety of tree ages. And we can do that again by harvesting in gaps or going out and removing single trees, which I'll talk more about in a couple slides. And so by doing so and harvesting at different times, removing trees at different times, and emulating that natural disturbance, this is going to promote a variety of age classes, young to old trees across our forest. And so this means that all the different roles of the different ages of trees are being filled. We have the young trees, we have middle-aged trees, and older trees. And also structural diversity is really important. And so what's structural diversity? These are just different shapes and sizes of trees in our landscape. So what this could look like is leaving behind snags or standing dead trees. As long as it's not threatening your house or another structure, these snags provide really important benefits for wildlife, especially cavity nesting wildlife. Wolf trees are just those really ugly looking trees out there that are probably still living, but they're just looking really ugly. Those also provide benefits for wildlife. So leaving these behind. Another aspect of structural diversity that feeds into species and age class diversity is when we have a diverse structure vertically. So maybe we have white pine up in the overstory, and then we have balsam fir growing here in the understory, and maybe we have some shrubs further down. So thinking about that vertical stratification of species so that we're meeting all the different needs of wildlife and promoting just that diversity across the stand as we think vertically about structure. And so thinking about diversity, and here in this figure, I'm showing species diversity specifically. What diversity does and why it's so important is because it creates redundancy in the forest. So trees, they all fulfill different roles, multiple different roles. And what's important to think about here is I like to compare it to a play or playing sports, for example. Each player has a specific role. If they get sick or injured and they can't fulfill that role, we need to have a backup who can take their place. It's the same in a forest, where a resilient forest is going to have multiple players that can fill the same role. So for example, going back to my red pine example, if a bark beetle comes in and kills off some of the red pine, I hope that there's some jack pine who can fill that same role in that forest. So there's redundancy and there are multiple players who can fill that same role. And in the end, this creates a stable, resilient ecosystem. And diversity breeds diversity. So when we have a diversity of tree species, of understory plants, we're going to have a diversity of pollinators, mammals, birds, etc. And when we also have a diversity of our plant species and animal species, we're also going to have diverse soil organisms. And I am a soil nerd as well as a forest nerd. So I love talking about how soils are their entire own ecosystems. They are interconnected with the above ground part of the forest. And when we have a diverse forest, we're also going to have diverse soils. And we need healthy soils to have healthy forests. And so these two are so interconnected. And so that's why when we focus in on biodiversity across this pyramid, it's just going to promote overall health and resilience of the entire ecosystem. Another strategy that's really important is thinking about trying to reduce competition, so opening up that growing space. And like I defined earlier, growing space is the resources, so light, water, and nutrients, as well as the space that trees need to grow. And through our stewardship, we can manage that growing space in order to promote the health and productivity of individual trees. A stressed tree is not able to get the growing space that it needs to be healthy and resilient. And so to open up growing space, you can do this in a variety of different ways. This is the bread and butter of forestry and silviculture specifically, which is the way that we manage forests. So to open up growing space, we can, again, promote those native plants by mitigating and removing our invasive species to open up growing space in the understory. When we think about the overstory and trying to open up growing space for our more mature trees, thinning is a great tool in our toolbox to do so. So thinning involves removing our suppressed, so overtopped trees, the trees that aren't getting the resources that it needs. And I'll show an example of what a suppressed tree is in the next slide. But thinning will allow us to go in and remove some of those suppressed trees to open up growing space for those other individual trees, and suddenly they're able to access the resources that they need, and they're feeling a lot less stressed and a lot more healthy, and that contributes to the overall resilience of the forest. Another option, especially when we're thinking about growing space for tree seedlings and saplings, is we can also think about controlling shrubs. So maybe that's hazel or alder, as well as aspen sprouts. Aspen reproduces by sprouting from the roots. So when you cut down aspen, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it sprouts back very vigorously. So if you want to open up growing space, another option would be to control those shrubs and aspen sprouts. But also, if you're thinking about doing this, consider your habitat goals, because that shrubby layer and the young aspen sprouts provide a lot of habitat benefits for different species of wildlife. So if that's important to you, I would consider that as well when you're making these decisions. If you choose to do some shrub or sprout control, mechanical, such as going in with a brush saw, mechanical control or a chemical control, if that's the right fit for you, is an option as well. But again, this might not be the best option for you if you really want to focus in on wildlife by promoting that shrub layer or aspen sprouts. And if we go in and control some of those shrubs and aspen sprouts, it almost also mimics the effects of low intensity ground fires by burning off some of that shrub layer in some of those aspen sprouts. So it mimics our natural disturbance through our management strategies. So I said I was going to show an example of a suppressed tree. So when we look at a forest, and this is looking at like deciduous hardwood trees specifically, but this would be the same for coniferous trees that grow more in a triangle shape, right? A suppressed tree is going to be completely overtopped by the other trees. So this tree is not getting the light that it needs. It's not getting the resources that it needs to be as healthy as it could be. So we can see it's overtopped by all these different trees. And it's also going to have a low live crown ratio, which I'll show in just a second. And it's also important to note that many species of trees are pretty good at hanging out here in the understory for a long period of time. And these are called shade tolerant trees. They're able to tolerate shade. And balsam fir is a great example of this. Balsam fir is great at hanging out in the understory and biding its time until those overstory trees die off, and then it can eventually replace it. So it's important to think about the long-term successional patterns of these forests, what eventually is going to be replacing those trees in the overstory. But when we're thinking about thinning, these suppressed trees would be the ones that we take out first. So even if you don't have a large acreage, maybe you have 5 acres of backyard woods, you could go out and if it's safe, take a chainsaw and take out some of these suppressed trees to promote growing space for the rest of these trees. And so a low live crown ratio is a really good way of figuring out if that tree is suppressed. So a live crown ratio is just the ratio of the crown to the entire height of the tree. A healthy tree is going to have, about the 60% crown ratio. It's able to get the light it needs. It's able to access sunlight, no problem. But a stressed, less healthy tree is going to have this lower live crown ratio. It has a really small, scraggly crown. It's not getting the light it needs. So therefore, it's definitely not as healthy as it could be. This is a good example of a suppressed tree. So you would want to look for this low live crown ratio and making that decision about what to thin. And of course, if you were working on a larger acreage, you would hopefully be working with a forester who would be able to help you mark these trees for thinning. Yes.
I guess one thing I'm concerned about is that if those overtopping trees are short-lived trees like birch and poplar,
Yes.
and you want those long-lived shade tolerant trees underneath some of those.
Exactly. So you wouldn't want to, so like in that case, so that's why it's important to think about like, what's that future of your woodland? Where do you foresee it going? And you don't want to take out that entire understory if you know that that overstory are short-lived trees, especially for birch and aspen, for example.
And keeping in mind that short-lived could be still 30, 40 years.
Exactly. Trees take a long time to grow. So yes, that's some really good nuance that is important to think about. All right. And so thinking a little bit more about how trees grow, trees have a priority list in terms of what they put their energy towards as they grow. So trees are always going to put their energy first towards maintaining themselves. So making sure that they're able to, move water and nutrients, making sure they're able to maintain their basic functions. Next, they're going to prioritize producing seeds and cones because a tree's #1 goal, besides accessing growing space, is it wants to survive and reproduce. So it wants to make these seeds and cones. Next, it'll prioritize height growth and then putting out roots so it can get water and nutrients. And then diameter growth is lower down on that priority list. So this means that trees are always going to grow up first before they grow out. And so, for example, if we go in and thin a stand, when we thin, and if we take a tree core before and after, so a tree core, just looking at the ages of the tree or looking at the tree rings, we could see, hopefully, after we thin, or sorry, let me put this in a better way. So a suppressed tree is going to have really small growth rings. Those growth rings are going to be really close together because it's not growing a lot each year. If we go in and thin, and if that tree responds to the thinning, those growth rings are going to become a lot bigger. because the tree is able to grow more each year because it's finally able to prioritize diameter growth. Because when a tree is suppressed, it just wants to get light. So it's going to focus on height growth before it puts on diameter growth. So this is one of those things that thinning accomplishes is by just opening up that growing space, allowing trees to put on diameter growth. So a tree that is maybe a 6-inch diameter at breast height, it could be really, really old if it's suppressed because those growth rings are really tiny. Another priority for trees is defenses. So fighting off insects and disease, for example. This priority can move up and down depending on what that tree is facing. So for example, a balsam fir tree, if it's fighting off spruce budworm, that suddenly is going to become a top priority because that spruce budworm is eating the buds of the balsam fir. So that tree is going to prioritize trying to grow back new buds as fast as possible. And so that means it's going to put less energy towards height growth, root growth, diameter growth. So defenses moves up and down. And so what this tells us is that a healthy, resilient tree is able to allocate its resources appropriately to all these different categories of growth. Meanwhile, a stressed tree is really just going to focus on these key functions. It's not able to allocate its energy appropriately throughout all these different growth patterns. All right, now I talk about invasive species. And like I said at the beginning, Angie Gupta on our team is the invasive species expert. I'm going to be highlighting a couple of invasive species here today, and we have handouts in the back here. I'm going to be talking about tansy and buckthorn, which I know are two very common invasive species that many of you deal with. So thinking first about buckthorn. So buckthorn is a non-native invasive shrub that is a huge threat to our forest because it outcompetes our native plants in the understory as well as our shrubs and seedlings. And so a really good time to look for buckthorn is in the late fall and early spring. And that's because since buckthorn is non-native, it keeps its leaves for a lot longer into the fall compared to our native species. And it also gets its leaves on earlier in the spring compared to our native species. So when all the other trees drop their leaves, that's a great time to go out and look for buckthorn because it'll still be green. And when we think about how we can manage buckthorn, I'm going to break down these strategies into the size of the stems. So for buckthorn, where the stem is smaller than your thumb, you can hand pull these or use something called a hand talon, which is in the upper right hand corner, or a similar tool just to help you pull out those roots. So anytime you see them, just go out and pull out those smaller individuals. And when you're doing this, you want to try to limit soil disturbance as much as possible, because if there's a lot of soil disturbance or messing up the soil a lot, this can cause germination in those buckthorn seeds. So we want to try to be as gentle as possible with our buckthorn when we're pulling it out. Thinking about stems larger than our thumb, what we can do is we can cut the stem at the soil surface, like this picture in the lower right-hand corner showing. Cut the stem at the soil surface in the late summer. And then if you want to take a non-chemical method, you can cover that cut stump with a tin can or a black plastic bag for at least 2 summers. And what that's going to do, it's going to stop that buckthorn from getting light. It's going to hopefully kill it if you leave it there for long enough. And you want to make sure you check it regularly in case it actually is sprouting, because buckthorn is crazy. You want to make sure you are checking on it and not just assuming it's dead. And if you do the tin can or black plastic, you want to make sure you're securing it. So putting in some stakes just so that the plastic or the tin can can't come off. You want to make sure it's really well secured in there. If you want to take the herbicide route, you can also treat the stump with herbicide in the late summer and fall. This person here is using a dauber. You only have to apply the herbicide on the outside part of the stump because that's how the buckthorn transports water and nutrients. So if you apply it there, it's going to transport that herbicide to the rest of the plant. But again, there's a non-chemical option as well as a chemical option if you'd like. The priority with buckthorn is you want to be removing the berry producing buckthorn first, because the berries is what spreads the seed of buckthorn. So you want to prioritize removing those individuals first and then focus on those smaller plants that don't necessarily produce berries yet. In terms of disposal, so buckthorn is a noxious weed that's regulated by the Department of Ag. And so since it's a noxious weed, we really want to be careful about transporting it off site. And if possible, I would recommend keeping it on site and burning it. If you have the means to do so, if you can get a burn permit, if you can do that and it makes sense in terms of the conditions. And there is a lot more guidance on disposal specifically through the Department of Ag. If you go to their Buckthorn page, which unfortunately I didn't link here, but if you Google Minnesota Department of Ag, Buckthorn, it'll give you all their great resources. Yes.
Does buckthorn sprout up from the roots too that are left behind?
Here's someone.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, cutting it can really encourage sprouting.
Sure.
So you don't want to just cut it and leave it there. You can do more.
And that's so like why covering it up and treating it with herbicide as soon as you cut it is a good option. Any other questions about buckthorn before I move to
Do
tansy?
you torch, do you like with low torch or something in the cuttings, does that suppress it or not?
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer to that. I would guess, I haven't seen that recommended by the MBA or by extension, so I would guess probably not, just because buckthorn is such a vigorous plant. So I would, but I'll ask Angie about that and get back to you. But I would probably prioritize these two strategies first, but you can also think about burning maybe.
You have to get after the roots. You have really extensive underground, roots and rhizomes that connect the plants together.
I feel like the burning is mainly going to impact that top part of the stump. It's not going to really be able to get down to the roots. So it might like cauterize the top of the plant, but the water and nutrients will still be able to get, to and from the roots. And if you have more questions at the end, we can answer those too. But for now, I'll move on to tansy, which again is a very common invasive plant that I know many folks deal with, and it's a pain. So first off, with tansy, making sure you're wearing gloves and covering your skin because it can cause a skin reaction due to the oils in the plant. So making sure that you're taking those precautions if you're working with tansy. So with tansy, throughout the growing season, you can go in and hand pull it or remove it with a shovel anytime, again, during that growing season. But you want to make sure that you're removing those root fragments because tansy grows through rhizomes. So these underground roots where it's able to sprout. So you want to make sure you're taking out the entire plant, including all of the roots, so that you're not leaving anything behind that could potentially resprout and form a new tansy plant. And that's what makes it so difficult to control, is because it spreads through those underground rhizomes. You can also mow tansy from May through July, because this is able to reduce seed production, but it doesn't kill the plant, again, because it spreads through those rhizomes. Please don't mow after July, because what that's going to do is spread the seeds. So you want to stop mowing after July or after any time that you start seeing seeds on tansy, because if you go in there and mow, it's going to spread those seeds. But before that seed producing time, it's a good way just to help reduce seed production and try to quell that tansy a little bit, but again, it's not going to kill it. If you choose to go the chemical route, you can also treat with a systemic herbicide. And again, the label is the law when it comes to herbicides, and all these recommendations in terms of specific herbicides are available through the Department of Ag if you want to go that route. And spraying with herbicide is most effective in spring and fall, and making sure that you're considering all the different aspects that come with making a decision about herbicides in terms of, do you have animals on site? Is pollinators a concern, for example, thinking about all those different considerations. And MBA is the #1 source, I would say, to go through when it comes to choosing these herbicides. Any questions about tansy before I keep moving on?
I found that the tansy is one of the first things that start growing in the spring, and it's really easy to spot tree.
That's a good point. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just that they're just a little whirl of leaves coming up if you hit them early before anything else comes up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Effective.
Yeah. And so again, since it's non-native like buckthorn, it makes it a lot easier to spot on the edges of the growing season.
Oh, I've run into when I've been trying to educate friends and neighbors about invasive species. It's like one friend of mine really likes the smell of tansy.
Mhm.
Lots of people in this area just love lupins.
Yeah.
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 It's like, so what's a diplomatic and effective way to try to communicate the really terrible impacts? I mean,
Yeah.
I've lived here only 25 years. I'm a newcomer.
Oh, yeah.
So that's garbage. And when I first moved here in '99, there was hardly any tansy along the Lighthouse Point Trail. It was just all beautiful native wildflowers. And then they decided to improve the trail and put in memorial benches and cut out the trees that were blocking the views of the lake. And tansy just came in and went crazy, and now most of that trail is lined with tansy, and it's just so sad to see that and see no efforts to, or minimal efforts. I don't know anybody who's trying to reduce that, even though I've written to the city. Anyway, it's kind of how you deal with that. Oh, we like these plants, they're pretty, they smell nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, if we're talking about, like a neighbor who's saying that, I mean, I'd say part of the issue is just the lack of awareness, not everyone is gonna know that it's an invasive species and all the negative impacts that invasive species have. And so I'd say just like, and obviously you're gonna know your community better than I do in terms of what it means to be diplomatic, but just conveying that information, because really a lot of people probably just don't know, unfortunately. And that's, I think, the biggest thing is just that lack of awareness, so just bringing people up to speed. And I think a lot of it too is our perception, like we call so many different plants a weed, even if it's like a native species that has, a lot of ecological value, we can still call it a weed. So it's a lot of it's our own perception and framing. And so like, I think it's just, we need to tweak that framing when it comes to invasive species. Like, yes, they're pretty, but they also have all these negative impacts on our ecosystem. And there are so many other beautiful native plants that we should foster. I don't know.
Can you cultivate other native plants that are just the same aesthetic, just going to basically be so competitive to those invasive species?
So in terms of others that are like just as competitive as invasive species, I don't know. Unfortunately, invasive species always kind of have the leg up because they're new to the ecosystem, and they don't have the natural competitors.
And
But
some of them actually exude chemicals from their roots that prevent all these.
very good point. Yeah.
I think tansy is-
Because if you get ahead of the genes early, then replace it with some native species, maybe.
Well, yeah, theoretically.
Theoretically.
And like, there are definitely there are native species that have the same aesthetic as tansy. So for people who are saying, oh, tansy is so pretty, there are native plants that.
Maybe a little bit of education, encouragement to those people to help understand. Maybe these native species are just as beautiful.
Absolutely. Again, it's all about that perception. Yeah.
We just went through this in Knife River with the DNR. Because they came to our trail that goes from scenic up to where they put the little fish catcher in there to catch the fish. And keeping it sprayed glyphosate all over. Without putting any signs up. And so we just had a meeting last week with DNR, 4 people from the DNR, 2 from Ranger, 2 from French River. And it started out this way.
Yeah.
And at the end, we said as Knife River Rec Council, we have trails and we have all kinds of people who take care of trails. Peg knows this. And we're happy to help you. Let us help you. Put volunteers together. You can come and show us what you want us done. And we'll have a whole group of volunteers to help you do that so that we don't have to spray ever again. And they were just like, oh. Oh, and so that's what we'll be doing. Well, next spring, we will get together and Peg and a whole bunch of people from the watershed group also will all get together with the DNR. And in the spring, when these things start cropping up, we'll go out and pull them. When you can still pull them out of the ground. And then we're talking about getting together with Dan Schuette's group. And what could we put in? And Dan would help us then put the native wildflowers in that we should have. And hope that will help take care of it. But that would be a perfect thing to do for the trail.
Yeah, because I think it's counterintuitive if you remove something, but you're not replacing it with anything.
Right.
Then more invasive species are
Yeah.
just gonna come in.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, exactly. And the disturbance of pulling something out.
Right, right. And then the other one they talked about, which I sort of didn't think about, was the Valeria,
Oh, yeah.
which is the white one.
Yeah,
That looks really pretty, but it isn't. And getting rid of that also.
yeah, that's another one. Really spread a lot of, in recent years.
This is kind of my pet question, but here it is. So I learned from Dan Schuette a while ago that a lot of, I know you brought up the clearing, And the invasives are coming with that, but I also know when gravel gets brought in,
Mhm.
tansy, and buckthorn coming on the gravel.
Mhm.
So and I further, when the road gets put in or when we expand the beach, or maybe when the trails got put in, two harbors, a lot of that stuff comes in with the gravel.
Mhm.
Do you know if there are any people that deliver gravel, if they, I know, there's a different word other than treat, because that brings up a lot of bristling, but
Yeah.
yeah, at least puts black plastic over it, does
Sure.
something to try to, you know what I'm saying,
Mhm.
reduce the seed.
Absolutely.
And who are they? And I wanna know, because if I have to order gravel, that's what I wanna work on.
That is a super good question. A really good point. And unfortunately, I don't know of any companies doing that. Does anyone here, since you're all more local than I am, know of anyone?
You know, the DNR, we talked about that last week, and the DNR said, well, you know, we're not looking for this, but it's just in the ground of the stuff that we're taking out, and you can't see it, so we don't know. I mean, it's not like-
I guess what I'd love to say to this group is, you know, in this way, consumers rule.
Absolutely.
If we kept saying that we only wanted to bring in gravel that had something done. And I don't even know if there's any approaches that are perfect, but something is better than nothing.
Mhm.
Because not doing anything really isn't working.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You definitely have a lot of power in that regard.
When I had a new septic system, put in, the soil that was brought in, I covered the septic was full of invasives. And
Yeah,
I
it
had years,
comes on the gravel.
yeah, I had thistles and pansy and all kinds of stuff.
The mound system is just.
Well, another plant that I struggled with, that came in when a gravel road was redone, is spotted knapweed.
Mhm.
And I have been out there for the past several years trying to dig out all the plants along the road, and I can't keep up with it. And my question to the county was, because they immediately said, this is what happens when you bring in gravel, and I said, oh, well, so if you can anticipate that, then can't we anticipate what to do about it? And that's much more easily said than done. One of my most recent things is I'm hoping to contact the road crews this year, because I made 2 sweeps down my gravel road to dig out the spotted knapweed, one in spring and one I was working on into fall. And in the midst of it all, the county came through and mowed and scattered
Oh, gosh.
the seeds and everything around. And I'm hoping to come up with some way to collaborate and say, can we talk about the timing of your mowing or something like that? And also with the spotted knapweed, and I don't know if this would be the same for anything else, but there is a movement out there. Some larvae have been brought in. I think they're both root larvae and leaf larvae or something on the stems, and but apparently that takes a long time to get rid of it that way.
Mhm.
So there are a variety of things.
Yeah, like I know, like biological control like that, like using insects is definitely like something that's very much evolving and improving for multiple different invasive species. Like that's something they're looking into for EAB. There's a lot of research on biological control. So hopefully that's something that's gonna be more prominent in the future for landowners.
I understand they mow after the live, so the pollinators don't get cut down.
Sure.
So you have competing priorities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's hard.
Yeah, they've gone with this big contract, but they're not supposed to, so. Yeah.
There's that whole wrinkle there.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Any other questions? I love this discussion. And we can also continue this after, but any other questions about pansy and buckthorn before I keep moving? Awesome. All right, so now starting to wrap it up and thinking again about forest health, which I've talked about a little bit throughout this presentation. But again, just being aware of the forest health issues that you may have in your area, whether that's spruce budworm or eastern larch beetle is something that people across northern Minnesota experience on their tamarack is another one, as well as things like EAB. And so examples like this would be trying to reduce the density of balsam fir in our spruce fir stands in order to reduce those spruce budworm impacts. I'm not saying remove all of the balsam fir because balsam fir provides wildlife benefits and other ecological benefits, but trying to reduce the amount of balsam fir since that is the preferred host for spruce budworm to promote the resilience of those spruce fir stands. And also thinning pine stands, again, to open up growing space, just to reduce the bark beetle damage. We're always going to get bark beetles. That's something that flares up and feeds on our pine stands. It's a native insect, but stressed, suppressed red pines, especially in drought years, are very susceptible to substantial impact from bark beetles. So thinning those pine stands is really helpful for mitigating those impacts from bark beetle. And always being aware of those emerging non-native threats. So I mentioned oak wilt earlier, that's not up here, and I hope it won't be up here at any point in the future. But just being aware of those things, and especially emerald ash borer is a really, really big one to be keeping on your radar, since that is a quick spreading invasive insect that feeds on our native ash species. And so here I'm highlighting, here I'll focus here first on the balsam fir. So we can see the balsam fir that's a little bit lower in the understory is being fed on by spruce budworm. We can see it's dead. And when with dead balsam fir, that's a really great ladder fuel for forest fire and increases our fire risk. And we also have red pine being killed off by bark beetle. If we were to go in here proactively before these forest health threats occur and promote resilience, open up growing space, hopefully we would be mitigating and reducing these negative impacts or preventing them all together in these two stands, for example. So in the balsam fir and spruce stand, if we went in there proactively and thinned out some of that suppressed balsam fir in the understory, that would reduce the total stress on those trees, promote the resilience of the stand, and help to mitigate those negative impacts of spruce budworm. Same goes for the red pine stand. Always thinking about growing space and making sure that our trees have the resources that they need to be healthy. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about black ash and replacement species for black ash. So first of all, black ash is a very, very important ecological and cultural species. It's also very negatively impacted, is killed off by emerald ash borer. And so we want to be thinking about how do we keep black ash on the landscape, but also thinking about replacement species for black ash. We have 1 million acres of black ash wetlands in Minnesota. That is a lot of black ash. And EAB was recently found in northern Minnesota for the first time last year over in Cass County. And that was the first time that EAB was found in natural forests of northern Minnesota. And so we need to be thinking about these replacement species. And that's because black ash is often the main cover type or the main overstory species in these black ash wetlands. And trees are really, really good at pumping water from the soil up into the atmosphere. And so what happens is if EAB comes in and kills off the black ash in these swamps, suddenly those trees stop pumping water from the soil up into the atmosphere. And what that means is the soil becomes wetter and suddenly that black ash wetland is too wet to grow trees. And then it converts to something like a grassy swamp. And it's not able to grow those trees and provide all the benefits that forests provide. And so that's why it's important to think about in preparation. And it's hard to say in preparation for EAB because I don't like thinking that EAB is going to spread. But it's good to be thinking about adaptation in addition to mitigation. So thinking about in preparation for EAB in some of these stands, what are some replacement species that we can be planting in the understory that can take the place as black ash if and when they die off due to EAB? There's a handout in the back from the extension website that talks about replacement species for black ash in wetlands, as well as the other types of systems where black ash grows, such as riparian forests. But thinking specifically about black ash wetlands, there are many different options that we can utilize as replacement species for black ash. That includes American elm, making sure it's disease resistant. American elm, like I said earlier, is looking like it's going to be very climate resilient. And it's looking also like it's going to be a good replacement for black ash. There's a lot of research going on through the Forest Service and through the U of M related to finding black ash replacement species. And American elm is a really good one. Same thing with balsam poplar, which is another native tree. It's a cousin of quaking aspen or big tooth aspen. Northern white cedar is another option, silver maple is another option, and swamp white oak, I mentioned this earlier as an example of assisted range expansion, so that's native just a little bit further south in Minnesota, more in central Minnesota, but swamp white oak looks like it could be a good replacement species for black ash as well. But this one is going to be more difficult to get through the nurseries right now, just because there's not as much demand up here because it's not native up here. But hopefully that changes going forward in the future. But these native species, the species that are native to this region right now, could be a good option as well when we're thinking about black ash replacements. So now, again, starting to wrap it up as we come towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about soil and water quality as a way to maintain our forest resilience. Because as I said earlier, I'm a soil nerd, and I always like to emphasize that we need healthy soils in order to have healthy forests. And the decisions that we can make in our stewardship and management actions can have an impact on soil and water quality and have a positive impact. But thinking about climate change and how that impacts soil and water. So when we think about climate change and our winters are warming up, maybe we're getting less snow. That means we're not getting as much frost in the winter. And in Minnesota, the majority of timber harvesting happens in the winter on frozen soils. And this is because frozen soils are much less susceptible to negative impacts from harvesting. So this is compaction and erosion and rutting. So we can get things like this, huge ruts when we go in and harvest when the ground is partially thawed or if it's really wet. This is what we want to avoid. This has huge negative impacts on soil health and therefore forest health. So we want to be avoiding things like rutting and compaction. And to do that, the most important thing is to know the vulnerabilities of your soil. Even if you're not going to go in and do a timber harvest, it's really important to know the vulnerabilities of your soil. Because, for example, if we get more large precipitation events, you could be at more risk of erosion, which impacts soil health as well as downstream water quality. Clay heavy soils are going to be the most impacted or the most negative or the most susceptible, to rutting and compaction. Sandy soils are much less susceptible to those negative impacts. Sandy soils are able to handle a lot, but they're sandy and therefore not very productive. Also, we want to make sure we're keeping our slopes vegetated with all those great native understory plants. If we go in and harvest afterwards, I highly recommend vegetating your landings and trails with native plants because that exposed soil is really at risk for erosion. So we want to make sure we're avoiding that. Also, when we do a timber harvest, or if we're just going in and removing a few trees from our woods, just doing that ourselves, we want to try to keep those harvested tops and limbs on site. And this is because when we keep the tops and limbs on site, that wood is eventually going to decompose and keep all those nutrients on site for the soil and for all those soil biota to use. And so you can scatter those tops and limbs across the site, though that can be kind of difficult if you don't have the equipment to do so. And so if you don't have that, you can also consider wildlife brush piles where you pile up those tops and limbs, and it provides benefits to a variety of species of wildlife, including pollinators. And I'll show a picture of that in just a second. And in the back, there's a handout from the NRCS talking about how you actually create these wildlife brush piles. And this is a great example for if you're cutting down a lot of balsam fir because of spruce budworm, you can stack and pile all that cut down balsam fir to create these wildlife piles. And like I said before, if we're going in and doing a timber harvest, and if you know you have these sensitive soils, so more clay heavy soils, highly recommend going in and harvesting during the winter on frozen soils and avoiding those wet or partially thawed soils because that's when soil is most sensitive.
I have a question.
Yes.
Regarding, not disturbing soils, going through, to get rid of balsam.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I see that people do sometimes is they bring in heavy equipment just to do mass removal. Is that even a good idea? I'm just going in there, doing it hand cutting down instead of bringing an excavator starting soil. Because that kind of bothers me when I see that happen.
Yeah, no, that's totally understandable. And so I think like for any large scale forestry operation, we're going to need to use large equipment, but we can mitigate these soil impacts through many different techniques. So one way is trying to concentrate the heavy traffic equipment into a small percentage of that area, not just going all over the place with the equipment, because that's going to spread the negative impacts of the compaction and rutting across a larger area. There's also things like, some equipment, use, or what's the word? Not tires. Track, thank you, tracks versus tires. That has a lower impact on soil. The state has, voluntary site level guidelines, which, includes, guidelines for how to reduce soil impacts during timber harvesting. So that there are different strategies, but you know, like anything we do in a forest is gonna have some type of impact, especially on soils, just trying to like reduce those impacts. Does that answer your
It
question?
does. I'm
Okay.
just trying to figure out what the best approach is with a smaller piece of property.
On a smaller piece of property, yeah, it's like if you have the means to go in and do a lot of that work yourself, or get community members, friends to come in and do that by hand, that's a great way to reduce negative impacts. But you also have to think about those larger scale pros and cons, like if I can get in there and remove balsam fir quickly using some large equipment to help prevent a larger scale infestation with spruce budworm next growing season, compared to working on it over a few years, you know, by hand. You know, so you kind of have to weigh those pros and cons. And so here's an example of a wildlife brush pile that I actually took here in Lake County. So this is an example of what you could do with cut down balsam fir, for example. And so this provides wildlife benefits, and that pile will eventually decompose and keep all those nutrients on site and help support soil health. And again, that handout is in the back. All right, so we're approaching the end. So I've talked a lot about tree planting. Well, where do I get tree seedlings? It's a great question. Soil and water conservation districts are great places to go to for tree and plant sales. So the SWCDs, they get their tree seedlings from the DNR State Forest Nursery. But the good news is that they sell them in smaller bundles that are more realistic for you all as landowners. So think bundles of 25, for example. If you were to go through the State Forest Nursery, you'd have to buy those in bundles of like 100 seedlings, and that's just not as realistic for landowners. So soil and water conservation districts is a great option. If you're working with a contractor, for example, who's doing tree planting, then you would probably go through the nursery. But if you're doing it yourself, highly recommend soil and water. Let's Plant Trees is a nonprofit working in northern Minnesota that distributes free native tree seedlings. So you can also go through them. I don't know if they've launched their ordering system for next year, but highly recommend writing down their name and Googling them, because that's a good option as well for finding those tree seedlings. Okay, so now as we get to the end of this, I've talked a lot about all these different strategies that you can use to implement or to improve the resilience of your woodlands. But a key message I also want to drill home is that just by being active caretakers of the land and by keeping your forest as a forest, this is the number one best thing, or this is like the number one priority thing to do as someone who owns forests. Because the biggest negative climate change impacts comes from when we convert a forest to something that's not a forest. So if we were to go in and cut down our forest and turn it into a parking lot, that has a lot of negative impacts on the climate. So just by having a forest, keeping it as a forest, that is amazing. And then if you're an active caretaker of the land, that is even better, especially when you apply some of these concepts here. And all these concepts that I talked about, I hope that you can apply regardless if you have 1 acre or 200 plus acres. And like I said, they're also just good rules of thumb. Even if we're not necessarily thinking about climate change, they're good rules of thumb for woodland stewardship in general, when we're thinking about being active caretakers of the land. And you have a whole lot of options in your toolbox to choose from when you're thinking about woodland stewardship, so that you can tailor your management strategies to fit your own goals. So now wrapping it up with key takeaways. So as we learned in the beginning, we know our climate is getting warmer, wetter, with longer periods of drought, as well as experiencing those changes in extremes. We're bouncing back and forth between our extremes. We know that a diverse ecosystem is a resilient ecosystem, and that includes species diversity, age diversity, and structural diversity. The Climate Ready Woodlands program provides those recommendations of tree species. It provides that toolbox to choose from, and then you can implement those species selections with some of those management strategies I talked about over the last several slides. And so we have those plant lists available for all 11 ecoregions of the state for you to choose from. And you have many, many options in your toolbox. So you have a lot of great ways that you can use your forest in order to promote that long-term resilience and fight climate change, thinking forward into the future. And I've mentioned Angie's name quite a few times, and I've heard a lot of people here are really active as volunteers in their community. Angie runs participatory science projects, a lot of them related to invasive plants. Some of them also are relatively new, and these are related to finding future climate adapted trees on the landscape. And that tree trackers one is run through iNaturalist. So this is just looking for species that aren't necessarily native in Minnesota now, but they could be adapted to our future climate. We want to know if any of those species are here now, and you can do that through iNaturalist if you're already a user, or if you want to sign up for the first time to use that. Highly recommend Angie's participatory science projects. She runs new ones every year. Like I said, many of them related to invasive species. And also, if you're interested, I recommend signing up for the Extension Forestry newsletter, My Minnesota Woods, to keep up to date on the stuff that we put out and the different programs that we offer. I'll give you guys a second. I see some phones. And I can also send out all these links. I'm assuming we'll have a follow-up email, hopefully, maybe.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, help us help you by filling out the survey, or at a minimum, leaving your email on one of the ones back here. Otherwise, we will not have a way to connect with you unless you connect directly with Hannah, which she does have hers.
Yes, I do have my card, so you can feel free to email me or call me if you have any questions. If you weren't able to get on the newsletter, for example, I can do that for you if needed. And I'll give it a couple more seconds to take photos. And the Z link and the QR code both go to the same place. So whatever is easiest for you. And again, just really like to thank all the my co-authors on this project and everyone who's been involved. This has been a really collaborative project with Angie mainly covering the southern part of the state and me covering the northern part of the state for this program. And then finally, here's all of our contact information for our team, as well as another QR code with another link for a feedback survey. If you'd like to fill it out, no pressure, you don't have to, but we love hearing from all of you. And with that, I just want to thank you all.